Hi, my name is Nathan Florsheim, and I am a photo and video instructor at the Evanston Art Center. Thanks to the Phillip and Edith Leonian Foundation, we are able to present you with a series of video tutorials to help you with your photography process at home. In this video, we will be going over the editing basics using Affinity. This is meant to be a follow-up video to our Camera Raw Affinity video, so I recommend you check that out before watching this one. So, the first thing that I often like to do is use the crop tool. I do this if I didn't crop in the Camera Raw editor or I want to make some slight tweaks to the image afterwards. You click on the crop tool on the left toolbar and you can click on the outside borders and click and drag to adjust the actual crop. Or if you hover outside of the borders until your cursor becomes a curved arrow, you can click and hold, drag left to right, and you can rotate the image, which is great for straightening it. Make sure to use the crop tool after rotating it to get rid of any white areas that appear. Up near the top of the window, you can also reset your crop if you need, and then if you scroll to the left, you can adjust what ratio you're using for the crop tool. Typically it'll start out as unconstrained, where you can crop freely, but you can change it to the original ratio or have it be constrained to a square if you'd like. This is great if you're trying to match a specific ratio or if you want a square image for an Instagram post or something. But typically I just do the unconstrained crop tool or do the original ratio. Once you're finished cropping, you can just hit the return key. And I always like to make sure that I don't stay in the crop tool, so I navigate to the top hand tool in my toolbar or the cursor tool underneath it and click on that. Because if you remain in the crop tool and you click on your image and accidentally drag, you may accidentally do some cropping. So I always like to make sure that I'm on the hand or cursor tool when I'm not using any of the tools on the toolbar. If you ever want to undo something that you've done in Affinity, to go back one step, you can do Command Z. But my preferred way is to go in the bottom right hand corner and navigate from the navigator to the History tab. And this will give you a list of all the moves and edits that you've done in this file while it's been open, and you can click on them to go backwards in time and see exactly what you did and where you want to go back. The one thing to keep in mind though is when you save it and close it and then reopen it, the history will reset and it will not save your past histories. Affinity also has this position slider, and if you drag it to the far left, it'll bring you back to when you first opened your image, and if you drag it to the far right, it'll bring you to the most current status of your image. So you can use that to navigate through your history as well. Once you've made any sort of change to your file, you want to make sure to save it. However, we don't want to save it over the original unedited file. We want to save it as a copy, so we have the original file that is left untouched and our edited version. So we're going to go up to File and Save As. If you get a smaller pop-up save window, you want to click the little arrow next to the File drop-down, and this will expand the menu so you have all the options you need to navigate. Next, you want to click on that drop-down menu and navigate to the folder that you want to save your file in. I go into depth about this kind of organizational system in my Adobe Bridge importing video, which you can still use along with Affinity, even though it's an Adobe program. So I would check that out if you haven't. But I already have a folder named Fuji Edits in my Iceland 2020 folder, so I'm just going to navigate to that. If you need to create a folder, you just hit the New Folder button in the bottom left-hand corner of the pop-up window. You can name it whatever you want, just make sure that you're creating the folder in the right place. If needed, you can rename your file up at the top of the window and go ahead and hit Save. Now we have our edited version saved as a copy in our Edits folder, and we have the original file left untouched in our Import folder. As we continue to edit our image, we can just save by doing Command S or File Save, and it'll continually update that edited version. The only time I do File Save As again is if I make a really substantial change to the image and I want to have multiple copies of the edited image. Next, we'll be using the tool that I use the most when editing photos. It is called the Curves tool. You go to the little circle that is half gray and half white. This is where your adjustment layers live. Click on it and select Curves. Curves is one of the ways that you can control the brightness, darkness, and contrast of your image in Affinity. I think that it is the best way to do so, as you have a lot of control and are able to edit specific areas of the image separately from one another based on how bright or dark they are. In this pop-up window, in the background, we see a kind of graphic that is our histogram. This is a representation of the light in our image. Things on the left represent the darker areas, and things on the right represent the brighter areas. We have this linear line going across it, and what we can do is add individual points on the line and move them up or down to adjust the image. When you move a dot upwards, it's going to brighten the image, and when you move it down, it'll darken the image. As you can see, when I place just one dot in the middle and adjust it, it does a general edit to the whole image. That's because the one dot is in the middle or the midtones, and since we don't have any other dots anchoring down other areas, it's going to adjust the entire line whenever I move it around. We can also navigate to the Layers menu to the right of the Curves window, and you'll see our background layer, which is our image, and then the Curves layer above it. If you click on the little checkbox next to the Curves layer, you can toggle between seeing your edits and removing the Curves layer edits to see what you've actually done to the image itself. I really like to do this continually whenever I'm editing to make sure I know what I've been doing and see how much change I've made. You want to make sure that when you're done looking at the changes you've made, you check that box again, because if you don't and you start to change the curve again, you'll see that no actual changes occur because the layer is hidden. So make sure that it's always enabled when you're actually doing edits and you want the curves layer to be live. You can start to add multiple points to the line in the curves layer, and if you're looking at the histogram and thinking about what I mentioned earlier, when you add a dot to the bottom left-hand area of the image, that will focus on the darker areas of your image. And if you add one to the top right-hand area of the image, it will focus on the brighter areas. When you add multiple dots, you can move them independently of one another to edit the image in more specific and detailed ways. A common way to edit your image with the curves layer and to add contrast is to add two dots in the areas that I'm showing you now and boost up the dot in the top right-hand area to brighten the highlights, and bring down the dot in the bottom left-hand area to darken the shadows. This creates a slight S shape on the curve and is a common way to add contrast to your image. When using the curves layer, I typically do pretty small adjustments, and the reason for this is I like to shoot my images and have them be exposed properly so I don't need to do a ton of editing. But the other reason is that when you're using the curves layer, it's very easy to go overboard very quickly. You can see that as I start to move these dots more drastically and add more dots to the line, the image just kind of starts falling apart and you get some pretty strange effects. Although this can look pretty cool and it can have some fun effects, typically when I'm editing my photos, I don't want to be going for this really, really bright and dark or colorful image. I want to have it look more closely to the image that I shot. If you do end up adding a bunch of dots and your image starts going a little crazy, you can always hit the reset button in the layer and it'll bring you back to the beginning. You can also click on individual dots on the line and just hit the delete key to remove them. Once you're finished with the curves tool, you can exit out of it by hitting the red circle in the top left-hand corner. If you want to get that window back up though, you can just double click on the little icon next to the curves layer and it'll bring the window back up. Next, if we want to make some general adjustments to the color of our image, we go back to the adjustment layer menu and choose HSL, which stands for Hue, Saturation, and Luminosity. We're going to ignore the luminosity slider on the bottom, as that just will darken or brighten the image in a general way, and we can accomplish that with more control using curves. The saturation slider will increase or decrease the overall color of the image. However, you never want to use the saturation layer to make your image black and white, as there is a better tool to do it. The hue layer will actually change the colors themselves, and it can look pretty crazy as you scroll through it. I use the hue slider less than I use the saturation slider, but it can still be a fun tool to play around with. To delete an adjustment layer, you can just click on that specific layer so it is highlighted and hit the delete key. This is one of the reasons that I really like using adjustment layers, because nothing ever is permanent. If I were to close out of this image and reopen it, the layers would still be there and I can always remove them or continue to edit them. If you do want to make your image black and white, you'll go to the adjustment layer menu and choose black and white. Right away, your image will become black and white. But the reason that I like this tool instead of the hue and saturation tool is it gives you more control over the image. What happens when you turn a color image into a black and white image is you're converting all those colors into different shades of gray. And this tool allows you to control how dark or bright each of these colors is as a gray. What this allows you to do is have a lot more control over the depth and contrast in the image in a way that you would not be able to do with the saturation slider. You can adjust the image by just clicking and dragging any of the color sliders left or right to darken or brighten those specific colors in the image. Or you can click on the picker option at the bottom of the window and then click on a particular area of the image, hold down and drag it to the left or the right, and it'll automatically select that area and adjust the corresponding color, and you'll see the slider moving. To show the difference, I'm quickly going to just add a hue and saturation layer and show you how it looks when you just make it black and white with the saturation slider in contrast to the black and white layer. So if you look and I disable the black and white layer and make it black and white here, it's a pretty flat and dark image. As soon as I enable the black and white layer, you can see how much more contrast and depth you're able to achieve using that tool. If you like how your image looks in black and white and you want to save it, this is one of the instances that I would do file save as again. So I would just do the same process, but I would add a BW to the end of the file name to indicate that it's the black and white version. That does it for our video on editing in Affinity. Again, this is just the basics that I consider essential to edit your photo with Affinity, but it barely scratches the surface on what's possible. There are plenty of other resources out there if you want to learn other tools, but I recommend just playing around with it and trying out new things. Once again, we would like to thank the Phillip and Edith Leonian Foundation for providing the funding to make these videos possible. Stay tuned for more videos covering Photoshop, other editing softwares, and camera tips and tricks. Thanks.